Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one of our little ranking tier list things. I'm Paul,
And I'm Dave.
and this time we're going to be doing video game controllers. This is going to be from the NES up to like the PS4 gen. It's nothing before that, and it's obviously not the brand new stuff because Dave doesn't have a current gen console yet.
Yeah,
And I don't think any of
yeah.
us have really had any experience with anything prior to the NES. So,
Nothing immediately comes to mind. I wouldn't be surprised if I randomly picked up a controller in a pawn shop or other sorts of places like, this is ridiculous.
I know I played a little bit of like the Atari 2600 when I was a kid, but that was very like maybe an hour or two, so I don't really consider that enough time to formulate an opinion. Alrighty.
Yeah,
Let's start off with something fairly new. It's the Nintendo Joy Cons.
yes.
Now, what are we thinking for these? So our ranks are S, A, B, C, D, and F.
Uh, it's one of those particular cases that with all of the controller stuff that Nintendo has been working with and done, these are interesting and high end for the stuff that they can do. But with that being said, they're also very temperamental.
They are.
If you're not careful with these things, they will either break, and even then, there's the risk of them getting dust or other particles stuck in them, and then having the terrible case of the controller not actually working, which I've had experience with.
Yeah, the Joy Cons are really cool from like a technological standpoint, but they're like you said, they're like fuck if anything goes wrong with them. Like
Hmm.
they're not terribly resilient. I'm thinking like B because they are kind of cool, but there are definite drawbacks to them.
Indeed. And the other particular thing, it's one of those cases that no matter what, it's a two-person system. You
Yeah,
get a Switch or the base Switch, and you have two controllers.
yeah, yeah. Maybe not the two, maybe not the best two controllers, but you can play two player with just buying the one console, which is nice.
Mhm. Yeah, so as I would say, it would sit fairly well in B.
Okay, so next up is the Xbox 360.
360 controller, okay.
Yes. What are we thinking for that one? Because to me, that and the Xbox One controller are almost identical. I
Uh, uh, I might have some words for you.
Granted, this also comes from somebody who never owned a 360.
Okay. Like I think at the very most your experience with an Xbox 360 would be seeing it and maybe playing a game or two at my place since I still have the system.
Yeah, that would be about it.
And this was sort of the upgrade from the original Xbox of them trying to do their own thing and trying to find room with their old controller, but trying to follow the base model, as it's say, to fit with most controllers that were coming out at around the time. And on whole, it's perfectly adequate to easily fit inside of your hands. Every button can be easily reached with index fingers and the thumbs. There's no real issue with fitting everything on there. It's kind of the base standard of how a controller should feel. There's nothing on it that I can specifically say is a real issue.
Yeah, there's nothing about it that's outstanding, but there's also like no major drawbacks. Like there's nothing about it where you're like, oh, that's a really cool feature, but you're also like, well, but it's also perfectly serviceable.
Mm.
Yeah,
Just ranking wise, and whether I'm questioning whether or not this would sit somewhere in A or if it would be another B.
yeah, that's where I'm kind of a little conflicted too, because I'm like, I feel like this might be A because I feel like it is better than the Joy Cons.
I think so, just with those particular options. And the one other particular thought I have is with all the particular uh, companies that are out there and have the particular controllers out there, what's kind of the base standard that you can hand a controller to someone, and even if they're not experienced with games, they can easily get into it. And this one would be one of the best.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So we'll put that in A.
Hmm.
And next up is the original Xbox controller, also known as the Duke.
Yes, very much fitting.
Controller you could kill a horse with.
I wouldn't quite put it up to that, but yeah, if you had a cord on it, it could be used as a decent flail.
It like I get what they were going for with it, but it's too bloody big.
And I think it's just the issue of its particular design and how much they wanted to actually cram inside of it.
No, that was the entire problem. Was like the engineers or like the folks who developed the technology for the controller just basically handed it to the person who had to design like the body, and it's like, okay, make this fit. So the guy was like, what the fuck do I do?
And the case with it is this is the style of controller that you can't easily hold in your hand. With the base of the couple buttons that you can reach, it's fine. But after you need to do certain button pushes or commands, you literally have to take one hand off to easily reach it, or become a contortionist to bend your hand in ridiculous ways to actually reach it.
Yeah, no, it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to use. So
I'm just sort of wondering that with its design, if it would drop it down to C or if this starts heading right into the D territory.
for me, this is a D. It's not the worst controller ever, but it's down near the bottom.
Like the one particular thought is that it's one particular controller that if you're not careful, you could actually damage your hands with it.
Yeah, no, I'm leaning towards D, but are you thinking C? Because I'm willing to. You've probably spent more time with an Xbox controller than I have.
The couple or bit of experience I've had with it, but no, I'm fine with sticking it in D.
D, okay. Next up is the Super Nintendo controller,
Ah, yes.
which I will. While it's a fine controller, it was a massive improvement over the NES controller, but we'll get to that soon enough.
I think so. I think it's a perfectly fine step up from what it was from the NES, uh, going into the SNES. I've only had so much experience with it, but I think this is kind of the baseline of what every other controller kind of designed itself to be and followed the format of it. Since this was the one that first developed shoulder buttons, added the typical, I suppose, either square or triangle of buttons to work with the right thumb.
Yeah, it's very much like physically, it's very much like everybody kind of copied this for a generation or two. Like they put their own spin on but if you look at the Genesis controller, you can see the influence from the NES.
Nope, testing one, two. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Oh, come on. Oh,
Oh, that's not good. You there, Dave?
yeah, testing one, two.
Yep. I hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, you cut out for a second.
Oh, that sucks. Okay. Like I was saying, with the SNES controller, you can see the influence like on the Genesis controller. Like we can see where Sega was like, oh, like that's kind of a cool idea, and let's put our own spin on it.
Hmm.
Yeah. So what are we thinking for Super Nintendo?
I'm honestly fine with sticking this up in A, with it being the base design and going from
Yeah.
there. It's still a controller that you could hand to someone and be like, okay, let's play on this NES.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's a very easy pick up and play controller. The only downside I will say about the SNES controller is it's too small.
Yeah, well, it's also the case of the Switch controllers when you're using it as a single controller. Oh man, those are tiny.
Yeah. No, I just mean like SNES controller was great when I was like 8, but now in my 30s I'm like this is too small. My hands are too big. Okay.
Mm,
Next up is the PlayStation 4 controller. What are we thinking for
this really
PS4?
good. It's it's always the case with PlayStation after they kind of got the base design. Geez, even around the PlayStation era of their base controller, they never really pushed that much further past
No, they refined it. They didn't do like a radical redesign or anything. Did you cut out?
that design since touchpad, which it's an interesting feature to kind of add to things, but aside from a couple of things on the menu and one or two specific games, there's not really too much else that you can really do with it.
Yeah,
At the very most, it started to get into the development time that it added online share functions or other sorts of things onto the systems, and they gave you a specific button on the controller to push, record certain things, and show gameplay to place online for streaming purposes and other sorts of stuff like that.
yeah. There's some cool innovations with it, and like you said, like Sony hasn't had a radical redesign of their controller. It's been, well, let's refine this a bit, make it a little bit better, but it's not a huge change.
As it's just with the typical controllers, this I think is one of the baseline. I think as it sits, since it's just the most recent and easy to kind of give to a person and they can go from it. So I'm fine with sticking this up in S.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's one of the best. So next up, we have the Genesis 6-button controller, because the Genesis had two distinct controllers, sort of.
Okay.
Did you ever play much of the Genesis?
Not really with that, no.
Okay. The Genesis
Okay.
had that weird boomerang design, and I kind of hate how it feels in the hand.
Eh, just kind of taking a quick glance at the base sort of look at it. It's understandable for the time and just with how they wanted to work with the system. I think it's the case that they wanted to add more, but it seems like 6 buttons probably seems like a little bit too much to mess with.
Yeah, I think it was basically a response to the Super Nintendo having four. Was like, oh no, but we have more buttons, which somehow makes our controller better. Because
Like,
Sega and Nintendo were very much in direct competition at the time.
and it's the question of what exactly do the extra 2 buttons do, if anything? Why are you pushing this on the game developers being like, we have 2 extra buttons, you need to design something for it in your game? It's like, what?
It's like, but what? For me, the 6-button and the 3-button kind of go in the same spot, and for me, they're C. They're fine, but I wouldn't go out like if you handed them to me, I'd be like, oh, okay.
Like, it's something that you could work with, but it would be a case of you'd have to kind of work with the controls a bit and most likely fail in a couple of games a couple times.
Yeah, I would be like, well, can't we use a better controller?
Hmm.
You have any particular thoughts on this one?
No, I'm fine with sticking it in the C, like you were mentioning.
Yeah, I'm gonna put the 6 and the 3 in C because they're basically the same controller.
Okay.
Which brings us to the Wii U gamepad, which you're gonna have more experience than I will because I never owned a Wii U. I did play it a bit once at your place, and it was fine. It was a bit awkward to hold because the thing's so big and it's a bit heavy, but I mean, it's fine.
Yeah, it was always the big sort of trick with this particular system. And it's kind of the case of how they designed the system and its base idea of it. Since the entire basis of the Wii U is all on this tablet sized controller. Because without it, a lot of its base ideas doesn't work. And you can't even use a Wii U without this particular controller.
Yeah,
So the system pretty much lives and dies by it. But with all the particular stuff it had on it, it fit well for the time of its particular recording, camera, and other sorts of stuff. It didn't quite push into the online basis that much, but it was still enough to send messages, do other sorts of things, and the interesting ideas of looking at a screen and instead of having to pause your game to look at a particular menu, see things just on your controller to move stuff around, gave interesting gameplay styles to things. But it was still a case of one of the best examples to bring up is the newest Star Fox. Zero, I believe it was on the Wii U, where motion controls as well as having to look at the screen with flying an airship can get a little cumbersome.
Yeah, no, I always thought like the Wii U gamepad was like a really cool idea. It was just never executed very well.
It was a tricky sort of balancing act to try and do with it. The idea was there, but execution wise, and especially with timing of the things that were going along at the time, just did not help out the system.
Yeah, like the idea of having like that second screen where you can go through your inventory really quick or something like that's a good idea. It's just
Mm.
in this case it didn't really execute very well.
Hmm.
So
So
where are we thinking
honestly,
for
just
this?
where it's sitting, it's the bit of a trick of I'm fine with sticking this up in B, but I wouldn't be surprised if it would drop down to C if you had any other discussion about it.
I'm fine with B. Like I said, I never really played it that much, so
And again, it's one of those particular cases of Nintendo is very interested with trying to get its particular idea for gameplay done through the controller. And sometimes it works, and other times it can be ugh, a little questionable.
yeah, they're always wanting to read they're always trying to like make gaming different and it rarely works out well. Okay. So next up we have the PlayStation 1 DualShock. Now this is the
It's always really interesting.
Go ahead.
Oh, testing one, two.
Yep.
Okay. Not sure if I caught exactly what you said.
Oh, I was going to move on to the DualShock, but did you have anything else to add?
No, I believe that's everything. And DualShock was the
That's the
second
redesign.
advancement.
That's the redesign of the PS1 controller. That's the one with the joysticks.
Okay, and was it specifically on the PlayStation 1 or was this more into PlayStation 2?
No, this came out for PlayStation 1. It was launched alongside Ape Escape
Okay.
because there were
Not
certain
understandable
there
with
were
this
certain
game or
games on the
something.
PS1 that you had to get a DualShock to play. You couldn't play them with the
Mhm.
base controller. So what are we thinking
Okay.
for this one?
Well, with this one, with my knowledge playing with PlayStation games, this was my introduction to the PlayStation controller style. It always had sticks.
Yeah.
When I was first introduced to the original PlayStation controller, I was like, wait, where are the sticks? Why does it only have a D-pad?
Yeah. I really like the controller, and like we've said, like Sony really hasn't made a huge change to their controller aside from the original PS1 to the DualShock. They haven't really redesigned their controller that much. To me,
Not
this
pretty much. As soon as they figured out that they needed thumbsticks to kind of work around with things, it was like, nope, this is it. You don't have to make any more changes.
yeah, this to me is a really iconic controller. I would put it probably an A.
Okay, I'm good with sticking it up there.
Okay. Next up, we have the Switch Pro controller.
Yes, with people first getting the Switch and being like, "Hey, can we maybe get an actual controller to play with, please?" And they're like, "Okay, here's something."
um, the Pro controller to me is like it's fine. Like it's a nice controller, but there's nothing really special about it.
Yeah, it's pretty much taking the base idea of all the particular buttons that would be needed and just adding the base controller style and feel to it so it can easily be held on to.
Yeah, it feels kind of
And
like
in most sorry, you go on over with your thought.
it kind of feels like an Xbox One or a 360 controller to me. Like design wise, it's very similar.
I wouldn't doubt it there. It's pretty much fitting the base design of easily fit a controller in your hand and have access to all the particular buttons that are needed.
So where are we thinking this? I'm either thinking A or B.
I'm fine with A for this one.
A, yeah, okay, I can go with that. Next up, we have the PlayStation 1 controller, so that's the one without sticks.
Yeah, this is my bias showing, but this is probably sitting a little lower for me just
Definitely.
with how much older those particular games are. Like I think my only memory of it was playing a Spyro game with it, and it's kind of like, how do I move?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a step down from the original one. I would be thinking C for this because I feel like getting the sticks is a big leap forward.
Yeah.
You're good with that? Okay. Next up, we have the PlayStation 2 controller.
Yeah, I'm good with that one. Test 1, 2. You still there, Paul?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So PS2 controller, where are we thinking for that one? Because it's again, it's the PS1 controller just slightly redesigned and
Yeah,
in
I
black
don't
this
think
time.
that there was really any updates that they specifically did with this one. Like I think at the very most might have just been rumble
Yeah, I was
features.
just gonna
Like
say I think they put Rumble in PS2.
so yeah, as it is with that one, it pretty much sits the same as the original PlayStation like or first DualShock PlayStation controller. Mm, Rumble was a thing, but it wasn't anything uh super dynamic to the controller, but still it was iconic for what it was. Pretty much if you had a PS2, this is what you'd be using.
Yeah, and they were really nice controllers. There's a reason that Sony hasn't had to do crazy redesigns because they got it right early on.
Yeah, yeah.
Next up is the GameCube controller. What the hell, internet? So GameCube controller.
Ah, yes. The gold standard for any person playing Smash Brothers.
Yes, and I will admit, like the GameCube controller, I this is going to be a bias thing, but I have a soft spot for it. I really like the layout and the design. It's not
Indeed.
it's not
Pretty much the
perfect,
same in
but
my case.
I would put this strongly in A. I don't think it hits S, but it's very good.
Now, I don't know. With the GameCube, remember you mentioned a controller too. They'd be like GameCube controller. And it's like, yeah, that tracks. Just with its particular design, button placement. Like, I think the only one button that people would probably question would be like Z being an additional trigger button that's up on the side. But even then, with its use and the design of it, especially with the particular games that were released at the time, it's one of those iconic controllers that everyone's like, "Oh, I know that thing."
You want to go S then?
I'm thinking it would be S
Yeah.
for it.
Okay, I'm fine with that. Yeah. Next up is the NES controller.
Ah, yes, the I'm not sure if it's a startup game like Resurrection of Games from the big, uh,
Atari Crash. Yeah.
yeah, from then, and just a
Ah.
case of two buttons, D-pad to control, and the start and select.
Yes. It is a super iconic design, but it is not a comfortable design to hold.
Yeah, I think the particular thing with it was redesigned from how it was originally as the Famicom in Japan,
Yeah, because that was
where
more like the Super Nintendo, wasn't it?
oh no, there was the case of it started as the Famicom base sort of design, but then when it came to the Americas, they redesigned it a little bit uh, as the SNES, and at the very most, the only difference was they hardened the edges of it. Like it's literally a rectangle, but with the older style controller, it was a little bit more rounded.
Oh, okay.
And with how the original console was designed, you could literally place the controllers on the system
Yeah.
when you weren't using it.
Yeah. No, that was definitely cool. So for the NES, are we where are you thinking for that? Because I'm going pretty low.
That's understandable. Like the one other thought that comes to my mind is Nintendo has re-released a couple of the older style controllers um, to be used in modern consoles and other sorts of things like that, and they started with this one. And I can't remember exactly how popular it was, but yeah, people wanted it. But I think that might have also just been the case of nostalgia and wanting to have the controller like that. as it sits, again, just with my bias, I played with this sort of thing before, but it's simple. I probably sit it around in C, same as the first PlayStation controller.
C? Yeah, okay, I'm good with putting it in C. So next up, we have the N64 controller, which is. Oh, God, Nintendo, what were you thinking?
Nintendo was thinking of its particular ideas of things. And no matter what, despite the fact that it went with this particular idea, it went with a better sort of idea of a actual trigger button with the Z button on the middle stick.
Yeah, the Z button is nice. I will admit that.
And that was sort of bringing up a bit more of the idea of having more of a trigger button to function in that sort of way. With the shoulder buttons, it sort of worked, but with this design, it really brought more of the idea of those additional R and L buttons that came onto the Xbox and the PlayStation controllers, at least within my mind. But no matter what, and despite everyone else's sort of thoughts on it, I have my bias, and this was really my first exploration in the game. So no matter what, I always loved the N64 controller. And it was just a case of you just had to move your hand. It's not like you had to grab all three of the control handles.
But no matter how you hold it, you can't get to all the buttons easily.
True. But then, of course, it's also the case of my bias against using the D pad for anything. But again, with especially the shoulder buttons, yeah, that was always a bit of a trick.
Yeah, so what are you thinking for this one? Because I will admit, like, the N64 wasn't my first console, but it was the first one that well, I guess I really dug into the NES as well, but it was definitely very early on in me being a gamer.
Hmm. Again, we'd probably have to be sticking with how this list is setting up and probably, or at least with me, and stick it up in B because it was inventive for all the particular stuff it did with it, though people most likely kind of questioned, why the heck did you give it three arms? What are you doing?
Yeah, I'm fine putting it in B. I think that's fine, and I will completely admit that part of that is nostalgia.
Hmm.
So next up is the Dreamcast controller.
Hmm. And I don't have that much experience with this particular one. Just off of its look, it still has all the basis and it seems like it could work, but just the shape. What were they thinking?
The shape is weird, and the other thing that's weird is the cord comes out the bottom, not the top. And I never understood the reasoning for that.
That seems kind of weird. Like the very most that I could think of is it would be a controller designed from an arcade machine. But even then, this is sort of sitting more home console. Like, what were they thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's not super uncomfortable to hold, but it is definitely bulky.
Hmm.
And it does have some cool stuff in it, like the VMUs were pretty cool, and they had like the little things on the screen and that. Like, there's some cool stuff in it, but it's not amazing.
Hmm.
I'm probably going for C for this. For me, is where I would be.
Okay, I'm fine with sticking it in C.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, yeah.
So next up is the Nintendo Wiimote and Nunchuck.
Oh boy. So, on the one hand, this is pretty much Nintendo's super big foray into we're different from other game consoles. Here's a remote.
Yeah, it was definitely Nintendo kind of targeting a more casual audience because grandma can pick this up and play it and understand it, right? Because if you're bowling, you just bowl. Like it's super easy to pick up and understand, but it
Again,
definitely
going with those particular motion controls and whatnot.
yeah, but it definitely kind of isolates your more hardcore fan base.
It brought so many interesting ideas, and again, just with the explosion of how this all came about was nuts.
Yeah, no, it definitely got a lot of people who had never bought a
Mm.
gaming console to buy one.
But I'm questioning whether or not that this would be enough to stick it up an S, or if it would be just smarter to stick it in A. Because just with how this thing came about and its explosion alone would stick it in S in most people's minds, I think. But I'm not too sure.
I would be saying A for me, but I would be okay going to S if you really want to.
It's been a couple of years, and there's been not really much to other ideas about it. Like, there's been the bit of work that PlayStation did with the idea, and then of course there's Xbox, but we don't talk about Xbox. Um, yeah, I'm thinking A would probably be good.
Okay.
Most likely, we'll probably get a comment or two being like, "What did you do, Bob?" But comments from people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fully expecting people to like be super pissed that we put the NES controller in C too. So
Yeah, we're gonna have to face that wave.
or a bunch of Xbox fanboys being like, "How dare you put the Xbox controller in D? It's amazing." It's not. I'm sorry, but it's not.
Sweetie, how was your hospital bill when you broke your hands?
Yeah, like how many times did you strain your thumb? More than
Yeah.
zero? Then it's a problem. Anyway,
Mm.
moving on to the PS3 controller, and this is not the 6-axis one. We're not talking about 6-axis because 6-axis never happened.
Duly noted.
Because 6-axis was shit. If this was 6-axis, it would be an F because that was terrible.
Duly noted. Again, just with me, with my experience with the couple of or PS3 controllers that I have, again, there wasn't that much that really changed again from any of the controllers. Like I think at the very most they switched into more cord-free controllers.
Yes.
It's a case that you could plug it in, charge it, but then use the controller wire-free without any sort of issues.
Yeah, so this
Like
was
aside from that, I'm not sure if there was too many other updates to it.
Yeah, so the big thing with this was it was wireless out of the box. Like the official Sony one that was bundled with the console was wireless, which was a big deal. And in all fairness, the Xbox 360 was wireless as well, but it required you to actually put batteries in, unlike the PS3.
Mm-hmm.
To me, and I might get some shit for this, but to me, this is. Oh, I don't know if this is S or A for me.
Okay.
I would probably go A because I don't necessarily want to put two PlayStation controllers in S, but especially because they're so similar.
Yeah, that's true. And again, I think just now in the modern day, and I'm not exactly sure how much is kind of coming with the PlayStation 5 controller, but easily enough get a PlayStation 4 and hand it to someone. It's like, okay, we'll play a game.
Yeah, and PS3 is super good. The PS4, the only reason I wouldn't put PS3 controller in S is the thumbsticks. The PS4 one had those little like indents, so it was super comfortable to fit your thumb in there, and it didn't slip off as easy. Whereas they hadn't done that yet
Okay.
with the PS3.
Yeah, they still stuck with the
The
rounded edges.
yeah. So you thinking A for PS3?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Okay. So next up we have the Xbox. I believe this is the original Xbox redesign that was corded.
Okay. Oh no. I think I actually have that one. I use it for my PC when I'm playing games.
Yeah. So this is, I will admit I'm not a huge Xbox fan, but this is a nice controller. It's not an amazing controller, but it is nice.
Yeah, it still kind of kept the base design of the controller, though it was still a case of it kind of expanded the middle section of it, so it wasn't too much um, space within there for the arms to hold on to. But still, it was a far better improvement from the original controller.
Yeah, absolutely. This one you could actually hold and play games with.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if this is A or B.
Well, I'd say that this is them sort of working with the design a bit and trying to fix it up. I'd say probably B, just since it's not quite heading to the level of the original Xbox 360 controller, but it's getting there.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'm good with B on this one. And finally, Xbox One.
Okay.
I know where
Again,
I'd
I'd
put this, but
I messed around a little bit with this since I have some family around that have the Xbox One. And it's still following the basis of it took the ideas that were worked with the Xbox 360 controller, updated it with all the particular stuff that was going on uh, electronic wise and how gaming systems were sort of going along, and went from there with this particular controller. There isn't that much that really updates uh, from it. But again, if you have any of the secondary consoles nowadays, this is the controller, and you can easily enough play any sort of games that you get with this controller for the Xbox.
Yeah, for me, this goes in S because it's by far. Look, the original Xbox controller was bad. It got a redesign and it got better. The 360 was redesigned again and it was really good. And this is kind of the pinnacle of okay, we finally really nailed it here.
Test one, two.
Yep.
Okay, there you are.
Yeah, so to me, this is S because it is Microsoft and Xbox kind of really nailing the design this time.
Mm-hmm.
It took them a few goes, but they definitely got it in the end for me.
Yes, yes.
Would you tend to agree on that?
Yeah, with that,
Yeah.
I'm perfectly fine with that.
Okay, let's do a quick recap here. So in S, we have the PlayStation 4, GameCube, and Xbox One controllers.
Yeah, pretty much with this entire list, once you kind of mention to it, it's like S tier is pretty much the controller for PlayStation, the controller for Nintendo, and the controller for Xbox.
Yeah, well, yeah, kind of. A rank is the 360, Super Nintendo, DualShock, Switch Pro controller, PS2, Wiimote Nunchuck, and PS3.
Pretty much any controller you can hand it to a person, and it's like, okay, let's play a game.
Yeah, exactly. They're super easy to pick up and play. They're maybe not the best controllers ever, but they're very strong. B is the what do you call the Joy Cons,
Yep.
the Wii U gamepad, N64 controller, and the original Xbox redesign that actually made it playable.
So aside from the Xbox, it's pretty much the Nintendo section being inventive with its controllers.
Yeah, fucking hell, Nintendo. And in C, we have the Genesis 6 button, the Genesis 3 button, the original PlayStation 1 controller, NES, and the Dreamcast controllers.
You know, you got a game to play, and here's something.
Yeah.
It'll work.
Yeah, and in D, we have the original Xbox controller, also known as the Duke.
Yeah.
Where, look, if you're really hard up, I guess you could use it, but nobody would want you to.
I managed with it, but it was the case of I had to take one hand off the controller and actually push the buttons like a computer.
Yeah, it was not a good design. So I think that's going to be it for this time. I've been Paul.
And I've been Dave.